Inflation in the economy can be defined as the rate of increase in price over a given period of time. This is often a broad measure of inflation and shows the overall increase in price. For example, an increase in the cost of living in a country is considered as an inflation. Inflation becomes a serious matter for various governments and individuals. The next is problem statement. Inflation is the gradual loss of a country's currency buying value over time. The increase in the average price level of a set of selected goods and services in an economy over time can be used to calculate a quantitative estimate of the rate at which buying power declines. Inflation is distinguished from deflation, which happens when money's purchasing power rises but price falls. When inflation occurs in a country, it should be a hard concern because inflation brings many disadvantages not only to the economy of the country but also individuals living in the country. Next is research objective. The purpose of the study is to research determinants of the inflation in Malaysia. Specific objective to identify the factor affecting inflation in Malaysia, to examine the relationship between the determinants and inflation, and to propose recommendation for a stable inflation rate. For the research question, what are the factors that affect the inflation in Malaysia? What are the relationship between determinant and inflation? And what are the recommendations for a stable inflation rate? For the scope of the study, this study was carried out in Malaysia, which is to determine the factor that caused the rise of the inflation rate in Malaysia. All the data are collected from the secondary data and time series data was obtained from a website named indexmodeling.com. The significance of the study is to understand the relationship between inflation rate and independent variable of the economic growth (GDP), unemployment rate, and population growth. This study also to identify the relationship between inflation and three factors of inflation rate in Malaysia.
Like in other studies, this particular study also has some unavoidable limitations. Limitations are influences that the researchers cannot control. There are shortcomings that cannot be controlled by the researcher.
First limitation is the study was carried out by not considering the effect of what happened during the COVID-19 on inflation. Next, this study only used quantitative analysis where it can be counted or measured with the information of given numerical value. And lastly, data restrictions. All data that researchers search from the previous 30 years is easily available.
Next is operational definition, which is determination, inflation, GDP, unemployment, and also population.
Hi, my name is Naamili Sudeni and I'm going to talk about the literature review. We begin with a review of the literature on the impacts of independent inflation variables, namely GDP, unemployment rate, and population, and the relationship between these variables. First is inflation. In the literature, inflation can be explained by various factors. Based on Amadou, in 2012, it was found that inflation occurs when the price of the most goods and services continue rising upward, which will lead for the standard of living cost falls because we have to spend a lot of money to get the same amount of goods and services that we bought previous times. Next is gross domestic product. A study conducted by Fisher in 1993 showed that the relationship between inflation and GDP is negative. He explains that when the GDP of a country is solid, their inflation rate will decrease or vice versa. In many recent studies, if inflation rates are below threshold value, the relationship is generally positive or insignificant. But if the inflation rates are above the threshold value, the effect of inflation on growth is usually found to be negative and significant. Moving to unemployment. Throughout some studies that have been made, there is a negative relationship between the unemployment rate and inflation. According to the Phillips curve, the inflation rate will decrease when the unemployment rate increases, or vice versa. When the unemployment rate is high, this will lead to a high demand of people looking for jobs. Because of that, this can lead to exceed the number of jobs available in the country. In other words, it means that the supply for labor is higher compared to the demand for them.
Several studies have been conducted to ascertain the relationship between the population and the rate of inflation. Some research is being conducted to discover the potential factors influencing the movement of inflation.
Based on Julius and Takat's, population age structure is a systematic driver of inflation. This means that population growth and inflation have a positive relationship. The former governor of the Bank of Japan, Shikawara, stated that an aging population could lead to an increase in deflationary pressures owing to expectation of a slowdown in economic growth. Durga Kalaisevan stated that an increasing population and increasing inflation are positively correlated, which means that as the population grows, the demand for goods will increase, resulting in demand push inflation to occur. Microsoft Excel and Ordinary Least Square (OLS) is used to implement all the tests and produce the result of the regression.
Hello, my name is Muhammad Ali Fekai. Now, let us move on to conceptual frameworks where there are three independent variables for one dependent variable. So, let's go. As I mentioned before, there are three factors that affect inflation in Malaysia. These three factors are gross domestic products, also known as GDP, unemployment, and also population. Now, let us move on to data collection method, which include dependent variable and also independent variables. For dependent variable, the inflation rate in Malaysia for 2021 is very high, which is 2.5%. This is because there is a drastic increment of people getting jobs in 2021 compared to 2020. Because of that, there is a sudden increment in demand of goods compared to the supply that leads towards inflation. Therefore, we conclude that inflation rate, which involve demand and supply, does have an impact on inflation in a country. Next, let us discuss on the independent variables. The first independent variable is GDP. When inflation increases, the main impact towards the society is that their purchasing power will decrease. Therefore, it will lower the GDP for a country. The second independent variable is unemployment. A high unemployment rate will show a bad economic management of a country. However, when unemployment decreases, there will be an inflation towards the country since there will be a drastic increase of demand in goods. Finally, we have population, where an increment of population generally associated with a higher inflation. So now, as we can see, these are our proposed hypotheses. As for the final part of our research method, these are the data that we have collected for our research.